Adolf Portman's argument is that when the behavior, the outward appearance and expression of an organism accounts for a disproportionately large amount of evolutionary development, of creative and intricate construction relative to its more basic metabolic and reproductive functions, then it doesn't make sense to subordinate these behavioral or ornamental expressions to the internal identity, the genome. We don't express ourselves in order to preserve the genome because our expressions are way more intricate and have entailed way more evolutionary development and differentiation. The intricacy of expression in time of organisms outweighs in complexity whatever internal essentialist identity you might want to define. So if we see this as starlings being starlings, what being a starling is this complex social behavior that's manifest in time in this incredibly intricate dance. But imagine starlings that they would talk or write poems, write stories about murmurations in the past or murmurations in the future that they're dreaming up, that they're only imagining. This kind of intricacy of social coordination in human culture is all that much more astonishing. I mean, it's astonishing that we now share videos of starlings to communicate with each other. Same thing in Wordsworth, a poem like There Was a Boy blowing mimic hootings to the silent owls that they might answer him. He's conjuring the owls. In Frost at Midnight, we get a kind of consciousness of time passing when Coleridge says, the owlet's cry came loud and hark loud again. Here, the poet is trying to conjure reality, the silence, trying to conjure a mimic hooting. I'm mimicking you, mimic me, mimicking you. And of course, this is a memory of another boy, a dead boy. He's conjuring the dead by conjuring this memory of the boy conjuring the owls. Isn't that amazing? This interweaving of consciousness and environmental echoing. Likewise, here Frost is conjuring an experience of surprise. How your awareness as you read this poem of what it's describing falls down upon you as you go through these lines, just like the dust of snow. It's an awareness of a moment, a surprise. It's an aliveness, the dust of snow, the way, surprising sensation, surprisingly delicate sensation. But it's also saturated with death imagery, the crow and the hemlock tree. It's an awareness both of spontaneity, being in the moment, but also of mortality. It's awareness of mortality that's contrasted here with kind of a bitter, morbid resentment or regret that ruining the day. By this awareness of mortality, of the singularity of the moment, sacredness, the kind of magic of the instantaneous surprise, it's that total uniqueness is made more vivid by my consciousness of mortality, that it comes and goes. I can't hold on to it. That's what this judgment, the resentful, ruining the day, that's the morbidity of that has to do with its kind of settled dogmatism, dogmatic judgment. At the fish houses conjures a kind of magic weaving of time. The old man sits netting his net in the gloaming, almost invisible. So reminiscent of Coleridge's secret ministry of frost, of weaving action, netting his net. This is exactly what I mean by a practical identity. What is the net but the netting? Shuttle worn and polished. Even the tools are more than things, they're artifacts of their own use. The big fish tubs are completely lined with layers of beautiful herring scales, and the wheelbarrows are similarly plastered with creamy iridescent coats of mail, with small iridescent flies crawling on them. It's like iridescence within iridescence, mesmerizing image. I mean, it blurs the eyes, like she says here. It makes one's nose run and eyes water. The atmosphere, I'm blurring into my atmosphere. And a similar blurring happens finally through language. Language becomes more like a mimic hooting, like an echoing of the waves, than a means of objective representation. Indeed, meanings become inverted. The water is so cool that it would burn. Your tongue would burn. Transmutation. She's talking about getting transmutated by the environment, letting the environment so echo through her that she is transfigured. If you should dip your hand in, your wrist would ache immediately. Your bones would begin to ache, and your hand would burn, as if the water were a transmutation of fire that feeds on stones and burns with a dark gray flame. If you tasted it, it would first taste bitter, then briny, then surely burn your tongue. It is like what we imagine knowledge to be. Dark, salt, clear, moving, utterly free, drawn from the cold, hard mouth of the world, derived from the rocky breasts, forever, flowing and drawn, and since our knowledge is historical, flowing and flown. It's to say, since our knowledge moves in time, it's flowing and it's flown. Again, an inversion. She's saying, as if this is sort of like the Stevens with the snowman. He's pretending to be logical, to give you a logical reasoning here. Since, because, therefore, our knowledge is historical, therefore, it is flowing and flown. It's flowing and it has flown away? Flying? Are we talking about birds here? Or she's saying, so in other words, since our knowledge is historical, it moves with time more than meaning. The rhyme scheme, the echoing words take priority over the meaning. I flow with the sound of my words, not their meanings. James Scott's fascinating book, Against the Grain, makes the argument that what we now think of as the state form of society, rather than something that people have sought throughout history, Scott suggests that the state has been imposed rather by force of circumstances, that people were just trapped or actively coerced. Scott really suggests that slavery is integral to the development and the domination of the state form of society, and that our belief in it, the way in which we equate it with civilization per se, amounts to a kind of delusion or pathology requiring a 12-step recovery program. Today, he says, hunters and gatherers have never looked so good in terms of their diet, health, and leisure. Agriculturalists on the country have never looked so bad in terms of their diet, their health, and their leisure. So why is it that we're so misguided? Writing has served to reinforce a single homogenizing standard of value. Writing developed to as a means of accounting. Grain developed because it served accounting and taxation and social control, and written records in turn dominate the historical record because they offer a record. If you built with wood, bamboo, or reeds, you were much less likely to appear in the archaeological record. And if you were hunter-gatherers or nomads, however numerous, spreading your biodegradable trash thinly across the landscape, you were likely to vanish entirely from the archaeological record. The early state strives to create a legible, measured, and fairly uniform landscape of taxable grain crops, and to hold on to this land, a large population available. So Scott describes the state as crucially largely self-propelling, almost cancer-like social formation. It's never intended, never chosen. And then when you look at population growth over time, it does seem to have kind of a cancerous tempo to it. If the barbarian realm is one of diversity and complexity, the state realm is, agroeconomically speaking, one of relative simplicity. Barbarians are not essentially a cultural category, they're a political category to designate the line on the frontier where the barbarians begin is the line where taxes and grain end. The Chinese used the term Ran cook to distinguish between barbarians. The cook were the more evolved segment, comprised of those households that had been registered and who were, however nominally, ruled. They were said to have entered the map. So legibility, reproducibility in the form of writing seems crucial. And again, with the cancer analogy, there's something about legibility that is hard to contain, that spreads virally. The cash economy, I mean, that's what we refer to as the tendency to, the temptation to sell out, that it's hard as a gravitational force toward the lowest common denominator provided by currency. He concludes the introduction by saying the barbarians finally end up selling themselves out, selling both their fellow barbarians and their martial service to the early states. The barbarians contribute mightily to the decline of their brief golden age. So I think especially for us now, facing the destructive consequences of the Anthropocene, is to conceive possibilities of resisting this selling out. I think making this turn to recognize identity as something that happens in time, that comes and goes with events in the environment. That's the really crucial shift of ecological thinking, not just simply thinking about ecology as some kind of objective state of affairs, but recognizing our thinking as itself an ecological expression. We become who we are through how we communicate with each other. Moving beyond this Platonic or essentialist realist materialism, I think is a, a kind of becoming mature about ourselves as an expressive species. There's a kind of disavowal and saying, no, all our expression, it's just for identifying what's true. Um, I think a lot of this nature poetry tries to emphasize that I've given you, like A.R. Ammons, that what life is always unfolding and is largely a consequence of how you approach it. And tomorrow a new walk is a new walk. I mean, that openness. All routes of escape are open. I love that line. All possibilities are open. There's no essentialist reality out there dictating or limiting. I think this is part of what Borges' protagonist in the Garden of Forking Paths is getting at. A labyrinth of one sinuous spreading labyrinth that would encompass the past and the future and in some way involve the stars. It makes me think of this, the way in which it incorporates fantasy and magic and oracular, visionary involvement of the stars speaks to this, the themes we've been talking about in terms of chaos, the coastline paradox. Because the coastline paradox is, in a way, just the awareness that reality is in fact arranged for me at every moment. There is significant in the arrangements of the stars. It does tell me about my relationship to the world, where I am, who I am. What this bifurcation diagram describes here is the chaotic, unpredictable, sensitive dependence on initial conditions, interactivity. You make one choice, you choose one path, and that has an effect on what the other path is. Creates a new context of choice. Weaves a whole new environment. Through choosing your path, you create a new environment. That's just what history is. That's what the story is offering you. The forking path, the labyrinth is a novel, becomes a text. He says the way to decipher a labyrinth is to just keep turning left. And what do you do when you read? You just keep going, turning back left from one line to the next, right? So he's suggesting an attitude that the text you're reading opens up a new fork in time, potentially. Any text you read opens up a new fork in time. Every moment of your life opens up potentially a new fork in time. This is what he means when he says at the beginning that I reflected that everything happens to a man precisely now. Centuries of centuries, and only in the present do things happen. Countless men in the air and on the face of the earth and the sea, and all that really is happening to me. These images of transportation are images of mediation, mediated time. Who we are, like a novel, like a labyrinth, is a processing of time, a mediation of time. There's always a delimitation, a kind of false consciousness in reducing our movement through time to static terms, forgetting that time is always an ongoing interactive dance. So, like the coastline paradox, I think there's a dimension to Borges' text that is very troubling, where he wants you really to be troubled and to be like, oh shit, I can't, like in the Book of Sand, I can't read the same page over again. To share that sort of sinking, nauseating sense of dislocation, that life, as he says here, is that, is always slipping away, that all that there is what there is now, and relying on some assumption of steady reality deciphered to some steady map of reality is a false consciousness. But that disorienting, vertigo feeling is also a feeling of magic. The opening path, the experience of now, was a potential new beauty, new opening, new walk. So he's suggesting all these terms here. A pistol report can be heard at a great distance. So he's playing it like what you thought a report meant. He's playing with that. No, it can mean something totally different. It can be a report in a newspaper. It's likewise the name of the only person capable of transmitting the message. It's not the person that's capable of transmitting the message, it's the name. So these inversions of terms, from weakness I took strength, this potential, again, of what you thought was the map, what you thought was the narrative, can be totally flipped, and weakness can become strength. It's this openness of time. And again, this can all sound fanciful and outlandish and unrealistic, but the point, especially in connection with Scott's account of the state, is that the alternative of this dogmatic, calculating literalism is incredibly deadening. It reifies people, as one character in Bacurau puts it, I'm here for the body count. That's kind of what James Scott's account of the state entails. It implies that everything is countable, and that means counting life, counting bodies. In Wordsworth's words, we murder to dissect. In order to understand, we have to kill. In order to reduce things to the ledger, to the accounting, to the lowest common denominator, the state calculus. And that's what the protagonist in the Garden of the Fighting Passes, Forking Passes, is dealing with. This stultifying racism. I wanted to prove to him that a yellow man could save his armies. So from the perspective of the overwhelming commodification, deadening accounting, body counting of the state, his magical thinking it's not so much about the magic as just like any means of preserving life, of holding on to some kind of relationship, to the dynamic, living relationship to the environment that would somehow encompass the past and the future and in some way involve the stars. The movie Bacurau depicts a memorial kind of akin to Wordsworth's There Was a Boy, conjuring a spirit as a flock of birds taking flight. I want you to think about the role of magic in this movie. I mentioned that it is reminiscent of the magical realist writer like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The principle of magical realism is that magic describes the experience of a reality characterized by trauma. Indiscriminate violence happens. There's no other way to make sense of it, to pay attention to it without magic. Magic, mythology, dreams are ways of paying attention to reality that doesn't make sense, right? And indeed, it can be a very intelligent one. Remember in The Mending Wall in Frost's poem, he says, it's not exactly elves that are causing the boulders to fall. He's evoking magic there, or, magical creature, to describe something that our literal minded intelligence is not good at understanding. So magic is better sometimes at understanding not just trauma, but some aspects of the natural world. Magic isn't random. On the contrary, our understanding is what tends to be kind of blunt and, like Frost's neighbor in The Mending Wall, it sort of have this one answer, everything, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Just sort of this blunt, single solution to every problem. Good fences make good neighbors. This recreational militiaman here has a t-shirt that says Black Hawk on it. A notorious military shot down a Black Hawk helicopter in Mogadishu. Indiscriminate mass killing of Somalis ensued. And also a notorious film glorifying this slaughter. Iconic example, I think, of the glorification of indiscriminate slaughter. So I think a big part of what this movie is doing is sort of looking at what's it like to be on the other side of that slaughter, to be a kind of to not count literally on the map, but for your life not to count, for your life not to matter. How do you make sense of that situation? How do you respond to that reality? Bacurau is the name of a bird, we learn. So there's kind of an interesting juxtaposition here of the Black Hawk and the Bacurau. Black Hawk is a representative of this kind of lethal, literal, body counting state versus a magical alternate experience of time, a bird of history. Magic plays a pretty integral role in this community, represented through the whatever psychoactive drug it is that they take, the kind of magical powers of the deceased matriarch protecting the community. Seems to be a rich culture of music and dance. It's a strange sexual culture. Prostitution is totally normalized, and people talk of sex right after the funeral at the family hearth, in the middle of the family kitchen, arranged to have sex later. Sex is even kind of public, like people sort of clapping along to the rhythm of a couple having sex. And violence, likewise, has a deep part of the culture. And sex and violence are weirdly intermixed, also among the militia. So that's a contrast I'd like you to think about. The final line of the movie, I think, is, "This is just the beginning." It's about history. It's like a lot of sci-fi. It's set in the near future. And, the basic sort of parameters of our reality are very recognizable, I think, but exaggerated in surprising ways, but revealing ways. What makes sci-fi interesting is how it reflects on our social structure, not just the way things might seem right now, but how we reproduce ourselves over time is revealed and is explored, can be explored critically in science fiction. It can sort of speed up the pace of history and see how things might turn out that we don't recognize at the present because we're so immersed in it. How are we supposed to think about the sort of the representation of sex and violence in this movie, the representation of spectacle, the sort of social form of spectacle? There's a lot of use of, videos, cell phone. How does the spectacle of sex and violence relate to the reality of it? How does the experience of watching this movie, the sort of cinematic pleasure of the movie, it's a lot like a Quentin Tarantino movie. It's just loaded to the brim with kind of spectacular imagery and amazing music. It's really a cinematic feast. So as I was asking about the poems just looked at, consider how the sort of sensuous experience of the film responds to the questions about history and justice and politics that it's raising.